Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Stinemetz brothers, and this is the Pseudo Scholars Podcast, where we believe science isn't just for scientists. We really think that science is for anyone with integrity who wants to know more about the world. Each week, we grapple with reality by challenging what we think we know.
We like to ask questions about what are the cognitive biases that are plaguing our thinking and keeping us from being more rational individuals. We like asking questions about what makes the New England Patriots better than everybody else. And we like asking questions like, what is Bitcoin and what's the future of blockchain technology that's going to play a role in our society in the days to come? These are the kinds of questions that we like to wrestle with, chew on them, come to a better understanding, and then hopefully we leave informed, stimulated, and inspired.
That's right. And this week, Cade, we are diving into the generational argument. What really is the greatest generation? What was wrong with millennials, if anything? We're millennials, and I know we get a reputation for being lazy and caring too much about social media, that kind of stuff, right? Today, we are going to talk about the millennial generation and compare us against other generations. So it's really going to be a two-part episode in the sense that we're going to break this episode into two parts. Part one is going to be about what causes entire generations to behave alike. Why do we talk about generations? Why is it important? And then in part two, we're going to really drill down onto millennials and give millennials a hard time. That's our generation. So what do we do and think differently than prior generations? Sound good?
Yeah, it sounds great. And I would like to add that us even doing a part where we criticize millennials is a very anti-millennial thing. So in the middle of this podcast, the way that we're framing it, we are actually trying to rise above this generational complex that we all find ourselves swimming in. So it's going to be an interesting phenomenon. I'm excited to get into it.
Cool. And I think some people might be surprised by the takeaways. Millennials catch a lot of heat, but I have a lot of positive things to say about millennials as well. But we'll get there. Okay, so first let's get into why generations behave alike. But before we can really do that, we need to define what a generation is. I never really understood this before I started getting into all of the research. A generation is essentially a 20-year phase. And that would mean that in general, most humans live through 4 phases. Each phase is 20 years. Those 4 phases would be childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and then old age lastly. And the idea here, Cade, is that we are assigned to a generation based on our age, location, and history. So, for example, millennials, we were young children in the 80s and 90s, and we were all young children in the 80s and 90s together. So naturally, we were shaped in lasting ways by the era that we encountered during that same life phase, childhood. So millennials have come of age during the 9/11 and Great Recession era of the 2008 Great Recession. So it's understandable that generations would then share similar beliefs and behaviors because of what they've experienced.
And one thing that I would like just to add before we get into this as we're laying the foundation is I know that I get a little skeptical when I see that 20-year range and say, so you can be 19 and a half and you can have just been born and they're going to throw us all into the same big boiling pot. But when you see the similarities that you can link to these generations, it might cause you to rethink how accurate that gap might be.
Good point. Okay, so there's one particular generational theory or series of social scientists that we're going to focus on today because these guys have a bit of a controversial position, and you know that's what we like. We like controversy, right? So we're going to talk about the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory. Yep, exactly. Okay, so these guys, Strauss and Howe, who were they? They were social scientists, or they currently are social scientists. One is alive, one is dead, and they're historians. And they have basically tried to prove how history repeats itself. And I can remember from 9th grade AP history, Coach Touchtone teaching us that history repeats itself. So it seems like a good place to start, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we enjoy looking back at the past is to try to gain some kind of insight into the future. But one thing that they did that was pretty interesting is essentially they identified a pattern, and like you said, it repeated that there were really 4 stages of social eras that repeat themselves in U.S. history. So when you look at the history of the country, really you can throw people into 4 different categories.
Right. So one cycle, let's start by defining what an entire cycle would be 90 years. And then that 90-year period, roughly speaking, would have 4 turnings. Those are those 4 stages of social era that change. And I can explain that in a little bit more detail so people can understand. Turnings, as these authors, these historians call it, Turnings happen every 20 years, and they are basically what is driving generational change. So generations are changing every 20 years because of the historical events that are surrounding them. So an example of this would be the crisis period of the Great Depression, World War II period. So from the 1920s to the 1940s, it would be hard to argue that the United States was not in a crisis mode. It lasted about 20 years. But on the other end of that came a period of economic prosperity, the era of the 1950s. And so that would have represented a turning from that crisis of the Great Depression to the era of American prosperity. Is this all making sense?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And the assumption, obviously, that's underlying that theory, which I think everyone's going to agree with and not have too much trouble identifying with, is essentially that we live in a really fast developing dynamic world, right? Because if we didn't see this kind of change, these kind of big impacts, at least systematically every several decades, then it would be hard to say what's causing the change in generations, or would there be change at all? So that's really the underlying assumption and premise that you have to accept in order to kind of take this theory a little bit further.
Nice. And so Strauss and Howe, in their research, which I recommend people check out, their most popular book was called The Fourth Turning, and it was really invigorating, a page turner in the sense that it enlightened some ideas that I had never been exposed to before. But this method and this research that they've done has shown 26 turnings in American history. So they went all the way back to 1435, the kind of pre and early colonial era, and have come all the way up until the current era of the Trump period, and they've shown 26 different turnings. So I think the question we need to ask, Cade, is like, what are the ramifications if this theory is correct? What would be the benefits of understanding and studying behavioral generational attributes like this?
Right. Well, other than the fact that it's just interesting to know a little bit more about why we see people that are age, 21 to 25, and why we see that they act different than people that were 21 to 25 years before. Other than the fact that it's just interesting, it seems like it really is going to have a lot of predictive power in terms of understanding, well, if we experience these kinds of social changes or these kinds of events in different lifetimes, like we've seen war change things, or we've seen economic depressions, or we've seen booming globalization, then maybe when those things happen in the future, we'll be able to understand a little bit more about how society is going to react and the kind of people that it's going to produce.
Perfect. And I think that's exactly why this research has become particularly interesting. Now, we should mention one controversial figure who absolutely loves this research. And there are countless articles out there on the internet that I didn't even realize about when I had started reading The Fourth Turning. And they're about Steve O'Bannon. And so that's the Trump right-hand guy that a lot of people tend to be cynical about. We've talked about him before on this podcast. Harvard MBA, seems to be sort of a brilliant populist, but a little bit deranged and a little bit psychotic, and perhaps one of the driving influencers behind the way that Trump thinks about the world, and possibly behind some of the Trump policy. Steve O'Bannon is a really big believer in these four turnings, and he's attempted to use them to a large degree to predict the future and to think about how America should be behaving.
I mean, whatever we have to say about Bannon, at the end of it, he is brilliant, and he did some unbelievable work in getting this nincompoop elected. But yeah, definitely a controversial figure. And then the other thing that's a little bit controversial is just it's pretty hard to make this an empirical study in a lot of ways. It's a social science. There's lots of different factors that you can't control for. So we're really just observing and doing our best job that we can in terms of identifying what it is that we think are causing those changes. But the great thing about it is, anyone can read this research, anyone can understand a little bit about generations and say, do I see this as being true in the world that I am observing? And then do I see it true in myself? And I think that you'll find that there's a lot of credibility to what some of these things that they're saying. Exactly.
I wouldn't bring this to the Pseudo Scholars podcast if I didn't think it was really fascinating, slightly controversial research, but seems to have some pretty solid prophetic positions so far. So let's just get into it, and we'll show some examples.
Take us through the four turnings.
Sure. Okay. So the four turnings are pretty simple. You have a high period. Following a high period, you have an awakening. Following the awakening, you have an unraveling. And then lastly, after the unraveling, you have a crisis. And then following the crisis, the series would repeat itself again, and we'd fall back into a high period. So a high period is, as I said, a response to a crisis area. And it's an interesting period because it's a period where society tends to want to cooperate and tends to want to avoid the destruction that brought on the prior crisis. So people are banding together during these periods. Institutions are very strong, like our government and like church and like family. These institutions are very, very strong, whereas the individual is not as strong. Individualism as a premise tends to be a bit weak during this period. And as I said, religion plays a really large role during a high period. Historically, according to these authors. So it's really about a period where society is confident and collective in the direction in which they're leading. So the best example that we can give in modern history that people would know about would be the post-World War II era. So after 1946, and then leading all the way up to the JFK assassination in 1963, that would have been an example of a high period, according to the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory. They were responding to the Great Depression, and people basically roused up and banded together and lived through quite a prosperous time.
Yeah, no, I think that's again, I'm kind of looking at this stuff and saying, how much do I agree with it? How much do I agree with what the research is saying? But when you look at how polarized America is today, looking at a high period and knowing that we are certainly not in one of those periods today, really does let you know. I mean, when you go back and look at, when I've watched documentaries on JFK and stuff like that, it was amazing how the country was so aligned around a single leader. And it seems like what's really kind of the undertones of this time period, or these groups that are finding themselves in this time period, is just a wanting to identify with something larger than yourself, which is why I think you see, populism and nationalism, and then maybe even, identifying with religious institutions and things like that being really powerful for people during this time.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot about the 1950s and early 1960s, but as usual, the biggest impact that I've had would be television, because our father loved watching this television because he happened to grow up in this time frame. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But we were watching Leave It to Beaver and Andy Griffith and these like wonderful small town American communities where everybody was buying suburban homes for the first time and getting microwaves and getting 2 automobiles in the driveway. And generally speaking, compared to the prior era, it was a period of prosperity. I don't think that's arguable at this point.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Okay, so what's the influence of this generation? Of this period, the high period. Well, the biggest influenced group would have been the baby boomers generation, because it's all about the group that comes of age during the period. Okay, so this is a high period, and it was the baby boomers generation, our parents, who came of age during this period. And the archetype that gets assigned to them, they get called the prophets. So the idea behind this generation is that they were children during a crisis. So it exposed them to a community that was trying to rejuvenate itself and was calling for a new social order. And interestingly enough, a lot of the major religious reformed organizations, or like generations, all came up during a high. So the Protestant Reformation happened during a high, according to this theory, the Puritan generation and the missionary generation as well. So that's pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, it sure feels like it leaves a lot of opportunity for people to rise to leadership and great deals of power during this time, because you're kind of coming from a previous period that's in a little bit of flux and a little bit chaotic, and then all of a sudden there's this opportunity to come in and drive massive change. And when you look at periods like the Protestant Reformation in the 60s, there was tons of change that was coming from a lot of these impactful leaders. But let's talk about what turning number 2 is, Shane. Give us a little bit of intro to that.
Yeah, so just as the high was driven by a period of crisis, right? People banding together because there had been a crisis prior. The next period is a response to the high period, and it's an awakening. And to me, this is a classic example of how the grass is always greener. So we're living in this wonderful high period of the 1950s, and we've all got a toaster oven for the first time, and our mother wears a dress and cooks us food. But now we move into the awakening period, and this is the period where institutions start to get attacked. And all of a sudden, there's not enough individualism in the world. People are getting tired of social discipline. They want self-awareness. They want that individualism back. And they will often reflect back on the prior period, the high period, as being a period where there wasn't enough culture. It was an impoverished cultural era. So they're searching for these new values, searching for new cultural and religious renewal. So the best example in modern history of an awakening would be the consciousness revolution of the 1960s. Imagine hippies in San Francisco and rock and roll music. And the period that led all the way up until about the tax revolts of 1980s is when we're going to cut this one off, according to the theory.
Yeah, no, that it's really interesting to see how the 60s, because the 60s are an interesting time frame because you have JFK kind of early on during that time frame, and this great political revolution, and everyone identified and aligned around this, Irish Catholic who was taking over the White House for the first time. People weren't really sure what to think about it, and then it leading right into a period in the 60s and 70s where everyone was just screaming for, like you said, culture and art and individualism. And I think back to the TV shows, because I didn't live during this time frame, and I think about the Wonder Years, which is during that time frame, and you have the oldest sister, right, who is rebelling from the parents, and she's skipping school, and she's playing the guitar, and she wears flowers all over herself because she's just screaming for something more than just her parents' kind of structured institutional life of going to work and going to church, because that's what we do.
Right. So we're coming out of a period where everybody banded together in coordination against the Germans and the Nazis in World War II. And then we enter into this awakening period where America gets involved in a war in Vietnam, and it's highly, highly unpopular. And that's the era we're referring to here. So it's this awakening that's happened. And so, again, the most important question is we're talking about how it impacts generations. Who came of age during this period? This would be the Generation X. For me, the best example of it is our cousin Shane, because he's a little bit older than us. So Shane, you're in Generation X, buddy. And the archetype here, they're nomads. They were children during the awakening, naturally, and then they grow up under like a less protected era. So these are the era that we would refer to as latchkey kids. They were coming home. Their parents both had jobs, and they were coming home and opening up the doors to themselves, coming in and kind of just living their lives with less structure and less parental control.
Right. And all I see is individualism, individualism, individualism. I think we could probably just nickname this turning in that space, because and it's interesting to talk to some of these people that grew up during this time and the latchkey kids and how it affects the way that they see their parents today. I remember talking to my boss a little bit about this, and he just feels like he had to wrestle with a lot of controversial issues by himself in his living room watching the TV because mom and dad weren't home, right? So he's having to figure out what he thinks about the world, which is way, way different than what the boomers were being exposed to, with a much more tight family unit.
Right. And as the archetype describes, they were nomads. I think they were searching. I would consider them, as you said, like individuals who were searching, at least according to the historical archetype that we're making out here. But I think that's enough about that period of the awakening. So now we're going to be moving into the period of the unraveling. What comes after that awakening and individualistic search? Historically, it would be an unraveling. So the response is very much the opposite of the high period. It's when institutions are at their weakest. They're distrusted. Individualism is very strong and very flourishing while the institutions are broken. So an example of the unraveling would be the tax revolts of the late 1980s, and then all the way up until the economic crisis, the Great Recession of 2008. So, Cade, this is when we grew up.
Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting because when you look at the definition, I don't know, Shane, how strongly do you identify with this unraveling?
Well, I don't know if I would say that I feel that it had a huge impact on me because we were quite young, but the point is that this generation were children during an unraveling. And so we were raised by parents who were adults and parents for the first time during the unraveling. Okay. So it's not like the prior generation stopped living. They just advanced into the next phase of life. So children during the unraveling advance and become young adults during the crisis phase, which is about the phase we're entering right now in American history right now, Kate. So it seems that we were influenced despite necessarily knowing we were, because we were children.
Right. And obviously this is the millennial age, right? That's the archetype of the unraveling period. And it's funny because they refer to us as the heroes in the research, right?
That's right. Yeah. So they say that, according to the cycles, we are in line with the greatest generation. So we are the fourth turn from the generation of GIs, or the greatest generation, those that kind of stood up and fought World War II and saved the world types. That technically is us according to the cycles. So this is where the research becomes really interesting, because generally in the media, all we hear is negative things about millennials, but the research here says quite the opposite. It says that we tend to be highly protected as children because our parents raised us during an unraveling, and we were told we could accomplish anything if we set our minds to it. And that made us, and has made us, great optimists. And so as we start to enter into this crisis era, which is apparently happening today, according to the research, and will continue to happen for about the next 15 years, we are going to be optimists, and we are the type of leaders that the world or America will need to get us out of this.
Yeah, and I wonder if, every single generation, if this theory is correct, and you really do have these different turnings, then I'm thinking about what are some of the and things like that, or the social revolutions that have really caused a lot of this, excellent performance by the millennials, and this kind of, we can do whatever we want, and we can go to the moon, we can take over the world kind of thing. And I've got to imagine that it works in tandem with the technological explosion that's happened during our lives. And when you think about it, I don't have the stat off the top of my head, but the amount of GDP that's being produced now by companies with CEOs that are millennials is actually pretty staggering compared to what it used to be, because of all these different tools that we've had at our fingertips. So I would also imagine that that's got to be at least somewhat of a factor in the way that this research is depicting the millennial success.
Definitely. And that's something that's really unique that even the researchers weren't expecting. So maybe technology is a little bit of a curveball and could throw off this entire generational theory altogether. I would argue that it probably has the power to do that. But the researchers who wrote this book in the early 2000s were not expecting the amount of leadership for us yet. We're not at the phase of leadership. We are actually still in the phase of young adulthood. It's the midlife phase in which we should be like taking charge and really taking over in the next decade or so. So we're kind of jumping the gun already, which would be props to us. But we're going to get into millennials a little bit more, the pros and the cons. Let's just close out the cycle with the last cycle. And this is scary because according to the research, this is the era that we are starting to really kind of enter in right now. And this would be the crisis phase. It's an era of destruction. It often involves large-scale war. It's when institutional life is basically destroyed. Major secular upheaval is starting to take its course, and society is starting to refocus on reorganizing institutions. So we're trying to get behind a believer or a singular leader. And these are all predictions that were made in the early 2000s in this book. And obviously it sounds a lot like Trump. And so actually these guys are now starting to define this next era as having started at the Trump and Brexit elections and should carry on until 2030 or a little bit beyond.
Wow. So the implication is that in the middle of things starting to unravel a little bit, that we all unite around somebody, and that's just an implication of being in this crisis phase.
Right. And even if it, I mean, we're gonna unite this, the authors say we're gonna unite around individuals. So those individuals could even be the moderate leader in France, who's very different than Trump. Macron, I think, is his name. Or it could be Theresa May in the UK, or it could be, President Xi in China. So we're going to unite around individuals, but we're also going to start to rebuild our institutions. So this is the period of potentially reformation again for religion, arguably, according to the authors. It's also a period where we start to get more and more trust back in our government because we have nothing else to cling to. We have to unite to get through a period of crisis and potentially war if these guys are correct.
Well, and I think it's unbelievable if this is the kind of things that they were predicting in the early 2000s, because you got to imagine that going to the voting booth in 2016, that's really the biggest factor, it seems, in Donald Trump getting elected is just skepticism of politics in general, and politicians. And it doesn't matter how big of a nincompoop he is in contrast with, kind of a card-carrying lifetime politician. People are just so skeptical, like you said, of institutions, of kind of the organized society, of the man a little bit, right? So we need a leader to overthrow the man. That doesn't always go very well, though, according to the research, huh?
Right. Well, so they are absolutely trying to. This is the period of rebuilding, And so I think that I saw an interview with one of the authors recently, and he said if they could have written it word for word how to define a crisis generation, it would have been drain the swamp. So he was making a point that Steve O'Bannon and Donald Trump have really played in nicely to the way that Americans and those around the world are starting to think about their frustrations with institutions and the need to rebuild them. Drain the swamp, get rid of the old. Now let's build the new and regain trust and enter into a period of a high. But that's a little ways to come. So what's going on right now? Well, the Homeland generation is coming of age, Cade. I've heard them called Generation Z as well, but I guess the Homeland generation is going to stick. Their archetype is artists. So these are children during a crisis, and they tend to be overly protected as children because their parents are watchful of them, and they tend to be very socialized and conformist as young adults. So that's our nephew Levi, I guess.
I have to pontificate on this a little bit because having just moved to Houston a couple years ago, I thought a lot of the things that I was seeing in my friends who had, children age 13, 14, 15, I thought, oh, this is just a difference because I didn't grow up in a big city. And that's where all the skepticism and the safety and the protection that I feel. But it is so clear. I mean, it's amazing how I've seen just this stark contrast. Like when I think about us growing up, it was waking up, putting on a pair of gym shorts and a t-shirt, heading outside the house without shoes on your feet or money in your pocket or sunscreen on your body. And you just played all day. And that's just what you did. I have friends now who wouldn't let their kids walk out of the house without permission. Like their 15-year-old kid can't go for a walk down the street. And it's really, really interesting to see how it's played out because I feel like I've got 5 to 10 samples. So it's not a huge size, but of people that are certainly treating their kids much differently than even them. They themselves were treated by their parents, and they just believe that the world's a harsher, kind of meaner place, and that they were naive and things like that. So it's pretty interesting to see that play out.
And what's also fantastic about this, what also sort of defends this position of these theorists, is that those beliefs or feelings by the parents today, the helicopter moms, which are interesting to talk about because you see a lot of those. The helicopter moms think they're in a more dangerous era than the era of the latchkey kids. But the 1980s was like the high of highs for homicide in the United States. So we're in a much safer period now if you look at just homicidal behaviors in the United States than we were in the 1980s. But in the 1980s, I could imagine, our older cousins like Shane could just run about freely. And now we have children today who cannot, but they live in a much safer America. So why is that exactly? It's a mentality. It's not, it's not data-based thinking.
Yeah, right. It's system one type thinking. It's intuition because you look at the social media and you see 5 bad posts and you're convinced that's not anecdotal, that's data driven, but it's really not, right? At least that's what we're saying. And safety is so valued by this generation of parents right now. People that are raising kids that are between the ages of 5 and 15, safety is like the number one thing. And I have such a hard time identifying with it because it's not something I ever thought about as a kid. Yeah. I never thought, is this a safe situation? I don't even remember our parents really asking us, is that safe? Are you sure? Like there just wasn't that kind of skepticism, but I got to believe that technology, social media, having access to all of the news at your fingertips 24 hours a day and seeing these things makes people a little more skeptical.
Right. But, again, going back to the arguments here, it's a cycle. It's a turning. It's based off of prior historical events. We didn't have the media to the same degree we do today 4 cycles ago, but for some reason, 4 cycles ago, parents behaved the exact same way, at least according to the research.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is pretty interesting. And when I was living in Silicon Valley, I was shocked to find that children legitimately have busier schedules, more planned out schedules than their parents. We're talking 30-minute incremental blocks. Children with smartphones. We're talking kids that are, 10 to 13 years old, kids that worked at went to the Boys and Girls Club where I worked, that had smartphones with calendars blocking off their time. You go to school and then you go to violin class and then you go to Chinese class and then you go to the Boys and Girls Club, and it was just ridiculous. There's not a lot of opportunity for creativity and innovation the way that we would have gone into the backyard in California and played with snakes and found out the hard way that they bite. That sort of creativity and ingenuity tends to be lacking in this generation, according to the research.
Yeah, interesting. And I know that all of this stuff, if we took a deeper dive, we could unpack this for hours and hours and hours, has to have a long-term effect on the kinds of companies that are built and where these people are going to work and whether or not we experience growth or we experience a lot of people going to just kind of go work for companies that are already there and less innovative generations. All that stuff is implications of these kinds of patterns.
It is. And I'm sorry to say this about the Homeland generation, but based off of the theories here and based off of the way that I'm starting to see it, this is not one of the stronger of the 4 generations. They end up being a little bit broken later on. But we're not going to focus too much on the Homeland generation. That's the future. let's focus on millennials, Cade, for the rest of this episode. Let's talk about the good and the bad and the ugly about us, millennials. Let's do our best to put aside the research as best we can and talk about what people are saying about millennials. Because to start with the ugly, there are a lot of political commentators out there that are cynics about our generation, that say that we are entitled, self-interested, and no good.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And not just the political commentators, but I can even tell you, being at work, I oftentimes get kind of I know this is anecdotal, but I get well, you certainly don't act like a millennial, or wow,
That's right.
you know, they expect someone so much less mature and so much less put together, or whatever it is. I'm not bragging on myself here. I'm just saying the expectations of millennials are so low in the eyes of the generation above, but I think are even lower in the eyes of the generation that are above them.
Yeah, it's so true. And generally what you hear political commentators talking about as to why we are this way is it's because we've been told we're special, and we've been told that we can have anything we want. And some of that is true.
Yeah, everyone getting a participation trophy and things like that. I know that's a big kind of archetypal argument for why millennials aren't as, independent or as tough or as responsible as other generations.
And I think that's a legitimate point. And this might go against the research of Strauss and Howe, to be honest, because the studies are showing that giving participation trophies does devalue work in the individual. And actually, it turns out that the losers who are receiving these participation trophies, those that are not winning, are actually feeling pretty bad about themselves and are developing a series of like guilty behaviors because they're seeing that they shouldn't have earned this and that people are just being nice to them and giving it to them anyways, even though they haven't earned it. So it devalues work. It is pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I don't think it's really that much different. We could have run that experiment in the company up in Seattle where the guy wanted to pay every single person $70,000 a year, right? So your people that are worth more than 70. Well, so there was a CEO up in Seattle who vowed to pay everyone, and I haven't followed it extremely closely, but I don't think his company has performed very well economically, and the mechanism or the thinking is really not that different, right? If I'm worth more than $70,000, why am I going to come and sit next to a guy that I'm clearly outperforming and he's making the same amount of money? But I guess what you're saying is there's research that supports that in the kind of give everyone a trophy type of thinking.
Yeah, and these are the things that I think we deserve legitimate criticism for as a generation. That people say that we're too sheltered, and therefore we end up getting quite low self-esteem. Goes back to the participation trophy. So we enter the workforce as you talked about, and we all want to make a difference. We generally tend to have like a very idealistic position because of the history of the prior generation, the way we were raised. We want to come into the workplace and make a difference. We don't want to go work at a, I don't know, like some refinery, or I don't know, I can't think of a good example, but we all want to work at companies that make a difference, and right. What does that really mean? But the reality is that we are often not happy in the workplace when we first get there because we've come in with low self-esteem. We've been told we're special, and then we get crushed when we get held to a standard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we are seeing and experiencing that to be true. And just to kind of put a bow on this ugly section and get to something a little more positive for our generation, I think the thing that's really hurt us, and it's really the double-edged sword because of how amazing technology is. And when you look at the content that young people are creating and the companies that 20-year-olds are starting, we've never seen anything like it. But in the same way, the instant gratification, being in the information age where we have everything in the palm of our hand, Uber for transportation, or Netflix for entertainment, or even Tinder, the app where you swipe it when you like how someone looks in order to have relations with someone, things like that. Those have all, I think, been really harmful to people in a lot of ways. And I can even see how growing up in this technology age and this instant gratification hurts my attention span. It kind of shallows my desire for stimulation, and I can kind of veg out and binge watch Netflix for hours and hours and hours when doing something much more stimulating that takes much more effort. I'm just not really as interested in it because I'm just so used to this current that it pulls me in.
Yeah. And then the one other psychological factor relating to technology that you'll often hear cited when talking about the negative criticisms or the criticisms of millennials is we've learned to put filters on everything. We do it in our social media profiles. We have these virtual identities that are essentially fake, and we spend more time with our virtual identities and maintaining those virtual identities than we do our own identities. We spend more time on social media than we do actually interacting with people. And on social media, we always want to present a message that we've got it together, that we're tough, we have everything figured out. And it goes back to that same notion of the first time that we do get challenged, we don't really know how to handle it. Psychiatrists are concerned about how millennials deal with controversy or confrontation because we're just used to presenting this perfect image and being told we're perfect. And so when the real world strikes, how are we going to behave? And this is why employers tend to have a hard time with millennials. It's why millennials don't work particularly well in the military, or why millennials don't tend to be interested in participating in the military.
Yeah. So let me just tell this last story, and we'll put a bow on this. But this is just too good to pass up. So I heard the other day of a really top young engineer, maybe a Georgia Tech graduate, like a 3.9 GPA, shoe-in, really, really smart. I think he was actually pretty relational, which is not always very common for millennials, and could interact really well with people. But he's sitting in his interview and he's giving questions back and forth. Probably going to get the job. He's got the credentials. And the interviewers look at him and say, "So, Donald, do you have any questions for us?" And what do you know? The guy reaches down into his pocket and says, "No, I don't have any questions. Mom, do you have any questions?" And he had his mom on speakerphone in his breast pocket. So needless to say, he didn't get the job, but we all have Donald out there to thank for going into these companies that everyone has super low expectations for us. But anyways, I felt like that just kind of symbolizes it.
It does. And it's a pretty good summary of millennials, to be perfectly honest. This is the thing that we're challenging, or we're being challenged with as children that are starting to move into young adulthood and into a position of leadership. And right. I will say that Strauss and Howe recognized that every generational group has their challenges while they're transitioning to the period of midlife, where they ultimately, take control and become the leaders of their respective civilizations. So despite those negative criticisms, the good about millennials are often forgotten. So the Strauss and Howe theory actually say that we are the generation this generation, millennials, started in the United States first. We were the first to kind of catch on and begin the transition from the prior stage. And therefore, we are actually going to end up being the world's leaders. So for what it's worth, the theory says America is going to begot the majority of millennial leaders.
Yeah, no, that's great. Another great point that the research has to say about millennials is that we're going to be the largest, the healthiest, and the richest generation in U.S. history. And I think there's a lot of reasons why people might quickly cast that aside and say, well, there's other reasons that explain it. But when you think about how educated people are, how much we just care a lot as millennials. I think we're pretty aware, maybe not as self-aware as we should be, but aware of the things around us because of the access to information and knowledge and things like that, that you do see this desire to live a healthy lifestyle and financial discipline, things like that.
Yeah. And we're high standards. Or we have high standards, and we achieve highly. So these are things that are really good about us, I suppose. And the idea is that baby boomers took good care of us, brought us into the world effectively. Some generations make better parents, according to the research. Some do not. Baby boomers tend to make good parents. So we have high standards. We're big time achievers, and we tend to consume like pretty uplifting, optimistic culture. And we're generally thinking about how we can make a difference, what we can do to improve the world, and that sort of thing. And the book actually compares this to Generation X, who didn't have a lot of that stuff. And apparently Generation X was the largest consumer in recent history of like more derogatory culture or degrading culture, kind of like gothic, hard rock, Metallica music sort of thing was one example.
Interesting. Just to continue on, we strengthen the civic institutions of the country and physical infrastructure. So that's kind of interesting because it's a pretty big point in Trump's candidacy, is all about building infrastructure and things like that. But obviously, civic institutions, I think people are forming organizations like they never have before. Again, I think that's somewhat tied to the vehicle of technology, but everywhere you look out there on college campuses, they're the most active places for social reform and justice and rights for all types of people and things like that. You really see that well represented amongst the millennial generation.
Yeah, and we don't always have it right. But to wrap it up, in general, so far, based off of the research and what these guys are saying about our generation, millennials tend to be really well behaved, and we tend to be highly optimistic, and therefore could be, one of America's great generations, according to the fourth turning analysis. We are that fourth turning. We could be the next generation, GI generation, the next greatest generation. But in order to really prove this, we have to overcome the next turning, the fourth turning, which is the crisis phase. And that's where we're going to really start to take leadership in the next 15 years. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you say that we're optimistic. We're quick to, I'm maybe not always quick to assume responsibility, but the world leaders are all going to come from this millennial generation. Then hopefully that's a problem that you and I are eager to solve.
Yeah, for sure. So Kate, in closing, a final thought from me is that this is really interesting research. I think it is helpful to think about how organizations are influenced and how societal groups work together because of the way that they were influenced. But I will say that I am a little bit concerned about grouping people together and lumping all of these people together and claiming that they're all going to behave the exact same way. I think that's actually very, very dangerous behavior. So before we close, I just want to say that the group is really, or was, the focus of Marxism. And that's what Karl Marx talked about, the group. Grouping people, I think in general, has led to identity politics in the United States that's got us in this fractured position. Everybody wants to associate everyone with someone else and with another group. And it just starts to stimulate this us versus them mentality, which is really, really dangerous. So I want to talk about how the us versus them mentality is not the best mentality to have, and why that can be dangerous.
Yeah, well, and hopefully the excessive individualism, or not excessive, but the prominent individualism inside of millennials, we don't like being put in those boxes, right? We're constantly, at least I feel like I am, trying to kick my way out of, well, you're from the South, or you're a Christian, or you're Anglo-Saxon male, or whatever it may be, those labels. I agree with you, and it feels to me like even as we were going through all those different turnings, it feels to me like it's just this generation of ebbing and flowing. And like you said, there are strengths and weaknesses in every generation, but I think one thing that we want to do on this podcast is strive to live in the tension of the pendulum, right? And always swinging too far to one side and approaching the topic and the question from one angle and one answer. And what we've said is that that's usually the lazy type of thinking. That's system one type of thinking, where we go with our gut and say, you guys all look the same. I'm throwing you into this big melting pot. But really, we need to recognize the validity of the research, its power in terms of prediction and explaining why it is that you and I see the world in certain ways. And I think one reason that makes this podcast worth doing on this topic is that just being self-aware. Being self-aware of your biases, as we talked about in our thinking two-part series, but also of the social factors that are causing those biases, or just causing the way that you see the world. And really, I like thinking about these topics because it's like, oh, wow, that does explain me, but now I don't have to be shackled to that. I can actually rise above it as I become self-aware and decide whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. And that helps me to live in that tension and hopefully take the good parts of the millennial generation while also kind of pushing away on some of the things that are not our strong suit.
Yeah, that's very well said. By nature, I think we do try to group people together, probably dating back to like the way that we've evolved from tribalism, because our tribe would be warring against another tribe. And the sooner you can associate other people with another tribe, the sooner you can associate them with either friendly or enemy. So maybe a survival mechanism. But for whatever reason we do it, we certainly do. And it can be dangerous. So while this is just great research and fascinating research to be thinking about, I like the way you talked about being in the center of the pendulum and to be thinking about how to rise up and break some of the bounds and restraints that people would put on us by associating us with the group. And right. Just lastly, I just support empowering and incentivizing the individual. I haven't seen a better solution for society and for government outside of incentivizing the individual as opposed to the group. And perhaps socialism and Marxism could work one day in an era of singularity where we're all self-aware and amazing utopian beings or something. But today, I don't see it.
And I don't think that anybody wants to live in the generation of total isolated individualism where our great institutions are completely powerless and don't hold any kind of significance. Again, that's the kind of balance that we want to live in the middle of. But I do think, lastly, that this has some bigger implications into the way that we live life and think about these different groups, whether or not that's politics or religion or demographics and things like that. And I remember talking in a small group with some guys the other day, and we were talking about just the topic of mercy and how to be more merciful. And just in this space, just having compassion and empathy for other people, I've always found that it's so easy to criticize a group. It's so easy to criticize an idea. But all of a sudden, when I have to identify with individuals that are within that scope, I get to know them, and I get to find out that they're not as simple as I think. Human beings are unbelievably complex. So even though we have some telltale signs and there is some validity in this research, I've just found that that's the best way to build empathy and compassion for these boxes. And honestly, if you want to escape from these boxes too, go and interact with older people and prove them wrong. Go and show them who you are and that you're more than just this kind of research and what it's kind of divided you into, this nice little even-keeled person that has these bullets on a page. No one wants to be judged that way, so don't judge people that way, and prevent other people from judging you that way, I guess is what I'm saying.
Nicely said. Well, so the research probably has some value and then also some dangerous implications as well. But if the research is correct, we are starting to enter into this period of a crisis. It does seem that times are more tumultuous than I can remember in recent memory. And naturally, it's going to require a lot of good leaders to stand up and take the reins, restructure our institutions, empower the individual to do that. And that's where the millennials come in. So that's our calling, I guess, in some sense.
Yeah, looking forward to it. It was a fun one.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll be talking again next week, possibly on Bitcoin and the millions of dollars that we've made on Bitcoin in the last few months. Maybe not that much, but we'll talk Bitcoin next week. Anything else you want to say on this one, Cade?
No, I'm good. Let's go out and live it.
All right. See you later, little brother.
All right. Bye, big brother.